so many ideas going on in this project, but it's just the start.
Good design is all about creating that moment of bliss.
This is really also the hospitality and the tourism of tomorrow.
This is what we want to show.
We have created something which blends into the environment, and the house itself is basically seamless.
Imagine you were able to just teletransport.
You are on your own island in the center of Amsterdam.
I think you have to go there to believe it.
We now come to the final presentation of a category-winning Australian project in today's judging. We're moving to Brisbane. It's Cox Architecture, who we've seen already once today, with Thompson Adset. And the project is the Fortitude Valley State Secondary College, which won the school category. Over to the architects to see the presentation, and hello.
Hello, thank you. My name's Richard Colson, a director working out of the Brisbane studio, and worked on this project that was completed a couple of years ago now. This project was interesting in that it was the first vertical school for the state of Queensland and the first inner city school in about 60 years. I'll talk to you a bit about why that's the case. We started the project with a provocation that was this one. The contemporary school campus and its buildings must be a place that rewards attendance and participation in a community of learners. And what was interesting for us with that is that in the new digital age, the idea of being physically present is not always the natural solution. And so we were provoked into making an architecture that would compel students to be there. And what might that be? We used three drivers for the project. One was the idea of a city scale project. The project was on the edge of the Brisbane's city central business district, and one of subtropical response. Secondly, this idea of historical connectedness and community connectedness. And thirdly, a building that supported a new pedagogy that was being explored with the state, and quite an ambitious curriculum that was being developed by the new school principal. So as I said, the project is in Brisbane in the subtropics, far away from where we might have been joining together in Lisbon. The project in the centre of the page here is on the edge of Brisbane CBD. Brisbane is an interesting place, has quite a dense CBD, but quite compact. And the rest of the city is extremely spread out and is dominated by single detached dwellings on fairly large suburban lots. And most of the schools were developed like that as greenfield sites spread out with connected awnings between them. So the idea of a dense school was not really part of the vocabulary of the state or the city. What we wanted to do with our site is to see how much connectedness we could deliver out of it. And so there's rail station to the west, a retail precinct to the east, an historic street to the north, and then further additional station to the south. So part of the master planning was to develop this idea that the school could connect outside its boundary. Here is the project in the context of the city on the confluence of rail, major road, and leading into the city. You can see the Brisbane City River winding through here, and some of the sites that will be for the 2032 Games venue are within this image that you see. A blow up of the site, and the site really constituted three major buildings. One we see in the foreground here, the taller tower in the middle, and a third toward the rear. At the time, because this idea was relatively new to the state, we had to try and get people to understand the magnitude of the challenge. So I was looking at our site, which is this red shape on the right here, and comparing it to other local schools. And really this was the idea, to compel them to think about what you would need to do to produce the same capacity for students on such a tight site. What we did was use the idea of the vertical school and the challenges of that to look at what that might be able to deliver for us. And in the end, we were quite confident that transparency, adjacency, circulation, the chance encounters, the mixed mode opportunities and connectivity, all these elements that you might describe in a workplace are all very possible when you apply these to a vertical school. And there are these other drivers for us. In educational sense, the idea of students as partners, wellbeing and inclusion, focus on learning, and then the shared vision we had with the team of dynamic spatial planning, sustainability, and technology rich. Here's the site with the buildings laid out here. So we'll talk about the first one, which was the Performing Arts Centre at the bottom of the page. They had an existing building on site. It's a historical building rather than a heritage listed building. It was part of a nice suite of buildings along Brook Street. The department were considering demolishing this building because the brief they had for this zone wasn't a 3-storey brief, it was only a 2-storey brief. We strongly encourage them to keep that for mostly the considerations of community engagement and maintaining that connection to community. It was also a strikingly sustainable idea to not unnecessarily demolish a building that still had purpose. What it did was able to give us free space. So the 2 levels of brief we could put in the upper story of this building, and the ground level was able to be opened up into a shared courtyard. And so you could connect from the street through the ground floor of this building, which was for shade for the students, and into the performing arts space. And in section, it meant that the upper story of this building could look over the new adjacent dance and drama space back to the city. And what it gave us was a scale for the street, which we found really powerful. This community connectedness was really important. We had parents of students that were former students. You can see some of the shade and shelter strategies that we employed. A building led into a pathway to the vertical building here, and you can see it in a strong subtropical light. So this is the Baramban building. Baramban is an Indigenous word, a place of learning, and the school worked very hard for Indigenous engagement as part of this project. You can see the response to the east and the west, the strong street and the shading to the western side, and the diagram that we set up of 2 parallel plates connected by a shared atria, and the way that responded to sun, breeze and gathering spaces. We arranged the building vertically with heavily serviced buildings to the right-hand side for flexibility and general learning areas to the left. You can see here this idea of a community plate where we would allow general community to use the lower story and then have a series of public, privileged and private spaces for the protection of students within the space. Here are some of the ideas of natural light. Ideas of trying to get a full cohort of students within typical plans in this amphitheatre space. The idea of these general learning spaces and the connectivity across those with individual learning spaces within historical classroom spaces. So this idea of creating collaborative spaces, individual group work, focused learning, having the staff in the same presence on the plates, all added up to quite an interesting floor plan. Here you can see some of those arrangements of spaces, connection to landscape. Here you can see the 3 modes of learning all in one photograph. Landscape was emerging in this slide. And this idea of using the subtropical context and informal learning and formal learning in spaces outside the typical classroom. On the roof of the building, there was an opportunity to grow vegetables and use that as part of the teaching curricula and have that as a function space. Here's a rooftop view. The final building is the sports centre with specialist learning. Because it backs onto a commercial precinct, it had a fairly robust edge to the south, but to the north open to the green space, and it had a sawtooth roof to protect views of the school children from the adjacent commercial buildings. It had a dynamic structure to support the learning spaces above the court spaces. And at the time of submission, it was under construction with this large structure over the courts. The school worked very hard with Indigenous engagement and community, and the local elders were part of conducting a smoking ceremony at the end of the project, and has really been an integral part of the curricula, with all of the schoolhouses adopting Indigenous names and having a constant engagement and learning. So thank you for the opportunity to present. We're very proud of this project, and the students are very much enjoying it.
Thank you very much indeed, and congratulations on your category win. Christina, would you like to kick us off on this? You've worked in school contexts with performing arts buildings.
I'm afraid you only have me today to answer your questions.
That's okay. It won't be a difficult question. You talked about the possibility of putting a school in a vertical building, just as an office building could be placed in a vertical building, and that's an intriguing question. Now, it seems to me that the biggest difference between office and school is movement, and specifically times of movement, which occurs much more regularly in schools. Every hour the students move classrooms and have to circulate horizontally and presumably in your building vertically as well. So how does that manifest itself in your building, and how do you deal with peak times of class hour changes and moving from one space to the next?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'll sort of answer it in a couple of ways. One is that that was an anxiety at the start for this, for all involved, how we're going to deal with this vertical challenge. We ended up calculating it was much easier to have movements within the school versus these quite spread out buildings out in the suburbs. And so we facilitated it by a series of lifts, a series of interconnecting stairs, and then using the fire stairs as open breezeway stairways. So there are multiple ways of moving between. There's also a way of arranging curricula, so there isn't a sporadic movement of students. And we also worked so that students wouldn't necessarily have to leave and get to ground as a place of recreation, and there was places to dwell within the building itself, shaded spaces, and the idea that students aren't necessarily always looking for green space for engagement.
Thank you very much. Nuno.
Hi, great project. Looks like a very interesting school. I actually, when I was in secondary school, I had the same case. My school had 8 levels. It was like a tower. So it is exactly the same challenge that you have there. And I must say that when you are a kid, it doesn't make any difference. You know, you just use it, and you don't even understand if it's vertical or horizontal. No, they tell you where you need to move, and you just move. It doesn't matter. There was only one challenge for us. When you had sports, that was in basement -3, and if we had like sometimes running around the laps or something like that, when you have to go up to level 7, it was a bit of an effort, but we survived, so it wasn't a problem. The challenge that school yes, the challenge that school have, and there's a question that I have for you because I think you have solved it, is that we had no contact with outside space. No, although Porto rains quite often, like in Holland and in England. So a lot of times, when I was there for 5 years, I didn't have much contact with external areas. As I see in your project, you managed to have that because you created external areas in every level, right?
That's right. So we had the benefit of the climate, which allowed this to work well. And effectively in these school buildings, the circulation area is approximately 1/3 of the total built area. And if you can make that space non-conditioned, you're reducing energy as well as having everyone sort of working in atmosphere, and it's a much more pleasant experience.
There's actually, since I have the experience of having used the school like that, what is actually very beautiful is when the older kids were at the upper levels, that's why they organized it there. And there was always like, and in rainy days, and which is basically all winter, and it's basically when you have school, we had always this thing of having windows that had views to the whole city, which is quite interesting too, which you don't have in a normal school. So I actually have more memories of that type of school that I had from the normal ones I had that was just like in a big field that you move horizontally.
Yeah.
Thank you. Kim.
Yeah, thank you for a very thorough go through. I think it was very interesting. And do you see it as a campus, both horizontal and vertical, what you've done?
Yes, that's
vertical
right.
Village.
So there's three buildings on the site now, and the master plan allows for another two buildings on the remainder of the campus. And so, yeah, as the school evolves, and the school's really a response to the change of inner city living. So yes, so apartment living in the city is really transformed, in the last 15 years. So there's much larger number of families living here, and so the school is anticipating an uplift in capacity and can accommodate that.
I have another question, like Christina, about the vertical transport, because how many floors is the highest building?
Seven levels. Yeah.
7 levels, and what do the students do? Do they take the elevator, or do they mostly take the staircases up? Because there must be congestion. Yeah.
No, they're encouraged to use the stairs. So there are 3 major stairs throughout, but there are also 4 lifts there. So the start of the day, they might be moving up, possibly up to the top floor, but they may not necessarily need to transition from ground to the upper floor and back, throughout the day. It might be moving just within a modest number of floors in the tower.
The space in between Sorry. The space in between the classrooms, is that open? Or is it enclosed? I mean, it looks like it's open. Correct. So
yes, this is an open, naturally ventilated space with a 7-story atria within it, and so it's really sort of 2 wings of space connected by this circulation space, which was naturally ventilated.
Thank you.
And articulated to provide spaces for smaller gatherings of students on the edge for play and for learning.
A final question, which is about the sort of process of what happened between you as the architects and the client and the users. I mean, it's always interesting whether the client is the head teacher, to what extent you were able to be informed by what the students might think, or was this really a commission from an education authority which had very clear ideas about what they wanted?
That's a great question. At the start, we were working with the educational authority, and they had anxiety because this was new, and they were looking for someone to develop something that they could have confidence, let's say, to sell to the community. And so we were working with exemplars from other states and other parts of the world to demonstrate that it's possible and reasonable. And then through the project, they brought on the principal that would be the head teacher, and they were able to contribute further. So when I showed you before that amphitheatre space for a cohort of 250, that the principal there was saying we need to have this space. So we had to work very hard to modify and increase to make that happen, rather than say accommodate 2/3 of, a class. So the principal has quite a lot of power to drive the curricula, drive the way of learning, and the building responds to that way of learning. And so it made it a much richer project for that. and to have someone that effectively acts as the ambassador for the types of space, and then they encourage the children to consider this building, you know, as their own and very special because of its uniqueness, and have embraced that. So it's a circular thing.
Well, thank you very much for that, and thank you for the presentation, and thank you for your time today.
My great pleasure. Thank you. Enjoy your day.